Why do I feel like you've done something really stupid?
I cloned myself.
You cloned yourself?
Yoo-hoo! He can protect the city, and we can spend more time being best friends. Let's get fighting!
Why don't the three of us team up, and we can really vanquish crime forever?
Well, he's definitely super, but when you make a clone, you get, kind of like a slight downgrade, from the original.
I mean, can he fly?
Absolutely not.
I mean, as long as he's got super strength.
He's definitely, I think, strong of character.
Is your clone
I mean, by do you mean, does he have, bad vision? Because then, the answer is yes. Look out! The Joker! That's just a cat, Mr. Clone. That's just a cat.
And he's not even punching the cat. He's punching the air above the cat.
I can have sex with Batman, Mr. Clone.
What? Did he just say he can have sex with me?
I mean, he's just paying you a compliment. I'm getting the vibe right now that you don't like him.
I'm no longer as impressed as I once was.
I did have to get the money from an outside source to do it. I couldn't do it all by myself.
What do you mean, an outside source?
He's your tailor?
You mean Alfred? He's not my tailor. He's my confidant.
Yeah, but, you confidently let him shorten your inseam. Anyways, I told Alfred that, you were in trouble and I needed money to help you. So
you told him I was in trouble?
You are in trouble because it's troubling how little we hang out, okay? So I asked him to liquidate all of your finances.
What?
I made a clone for you, too.
Hey, who wants to What?
Meet your clone.
So let me get this straight. You'd use all my family's money to make a shit version of you and a hornier version of me. I'm Bat.
I love Bat.
Do you like Matt?
I like Matt. You?
Oh, Jesus.
Oh, man.
That's what it looks like when Batman and Superman are really good friends.